Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. On a beautiful June afternoon in St. Mary's, the sun shone brightly and the perfume of freshly mowed grass blended with the aroma of lemon cakes and cucumber sandwiches. Mrs. Dorothy Whittaker held the yearly garden party. The Whittaker estate's wide grounds were visited by practically every respectable town resident over the season. Miss Jane Marple, sitting near the tea tent, watched the gathering with her usual quiet attention. Her knitting needles clicked softly as her piercing blue eyes flicked from one guest to another, documenting each smile, chuckle, and slight betrayal of true emotion. Reverend Leonard Clement, who joined Miss Marple for tea, commented on Mrs. Whittaker's exceptional performance this year. "The drive to Dendrons is extremely beautiful," Miss Marple responded with a calm tone, but she believes Mrs. Whittaker's gardener, young Geoffrey, deserves the most of credit. "He's quite skilled for his age." A loud scream interrupted the peaceful setting before the Reverend could answer. Mrs. Whittaker stood shaking with a hand on her chest in the pavilion, drawing everyone's attention. "It's Cook," she said. "Cook is dead." Gasps echoed throughout the crowd. Mrs. Emily Gosforth was well known in the village for her culinary skills and sharp tongue. This woman is not easily rattled or felled. Miss Marple stood up with a quiet purpose, setting aside her knitting. She crept toward the pavilion, blending into the crowd like a shadow. Dr. Haydock was found kneeling next to Mrs. Gosforth, who had died. The cook lay on the floor, pallid, with an overturned Clare's tray nearby. "Dead," Dr. Haddock affirmed sadly. "Poison, I would wager. We'll have to send her to the coroner to be certain." Whispers permeated the gathering like an oncoming tsunami. Poison in St. Mary's. They lived in a peaceful village, not a horror film. Miss Marple spoke softly and unassumingly to Dr. Haddock, leaning in slightly. "A terrible business, Doctor. Was she recently ill or in trouble?" Haddock shakes his head. "Not that I am aware of. She was as strong as they come." Miss Marple nodded carefully and shifted her focus to Clare's tray. She saw the uneven arrangement of the pastries and a lone crushed piece beneath the corner of the table. "Such a pity," she said to herself. The village was abuzz with conjecture about her. Who could have intended to injure Mrs. Gosforth? Was it an accident or something more sinister? Miss Marple gently returned to her seat after the constable arrived to disperse the crowd. She began her knitting with a peaceful expression. Despite her placid demeanor, she was already analyzing the complexities of human nature. The scene was set, and the mystery of the poisoned cook was about to begin. Mrs. Gosworth's unexpected death spread through St. Mary's like wildfire on a dry heath. As the sun set that evening, households were filled with conjecture. The windows gleamed with lamplight as tea kettles hissed and tongues wagged, ready to scrutinize every morsel of knowledge. At the Bluebell Tea Room, a popular gathering place for rural ladies, everyone was discussing the topic. Mrs. Diana Trent declared, "If you ask me, it's that new girl from the post office," with her spectacles glinting in the lamplight. "I noticed her arguing with Mrs. Gosforth about a delayed shipment last week. Doesn't this seem suspicious?" Mrs. Perkins whispered, "I heard it was young Geoffrey, the gardener. They claim Mrs. Gosworth discovered him collecting bottles from the pantry." Perhaps she threatened to inform Mrs. Whittaker. Miss Marple sat quietly with her tea, listening without comment. Her hands were lying in her lap and her expression was still. She appeared to be engrossed in her scone, but was actually meticulously documenting every word, glance, and irregularity. The Whittaker house was in shambles. Mrs. Dorothy Whittaker, a large woman with a theatrical personality, fanned herself fiercely. Her husband, Henry Whittaker, paced the room, grumbling about the scandal. "Poison in our house. What will people think?" Henry snapped, staring at the untouched brandy in his palm. "Think? They'll assume we are cursed, Henry," Dorothy groaned. "The terrible harvest came first, followed by the barn fire, and now this. Emily is poor. She's been with us for more than a decade." Henry reluctantly admitted that she wasn't merely a cook. She kept the household functioning. He trailed off, his expression clouded with thinking. The door creaked open, and Geoffrey the gardener hesitantly walked in. His normally tanned complexion became pale, and his hands trembled as he twisted his cap. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Mrs. Gosforth was nice to me, gave me her leftover soup every Thursday. Dorothy sniffed and dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Thank you, Jeff. It is comforting to know she had friends. However, Henry gave Geoffrey a harsh glance. You were in the kitchen yesterday, right? Did you see anything unusual? Geoffrey hesitated, his gaze sliding to the floor. Nothing, sir. Just cook complained about her new recipes. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting, looked up and said, They weren't worth the paper they were written on. New recipes, you say? That is curious. Did she have a tendency of attempting new things? No, Miss Geoffrey said, frowning. She said she didn't trust them. I thought they were all wrong somehow. Meanwhile, Reverend Leonard Clement was confronted with moral issues. Mrs. Hartnell, the Ville's moral compass, exclaimed, Reverend, this is a sign. There's poison in our midst. This is divine vengeance for modern laxity. Too much fun and not enough prayer. Clement sighed inwardly and nodded graciously. A horrible event, really. However, it's important to remember that God alone has the authority to judge. I do not judge, Reverend, Mrs. Hartnell assured him with a sense of righteousness. I simply observe, and mark my words, it's the Whitakers. That family has always been strange. Miss Marple, who had come to return a borrowed book, overheard the comment as she entered the vicarage. What about Mrs. Hartnell? How is this so? The woman turned, surprised, and sniffed dismissively. Oh, you know, all that talk of investments and foreign travel. It's not natural. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she whispered, Indeed. Nonetheless, I find most people odd in their own way. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple put down her knitting and made herself a cup of tea. Mrs. Gosforth's death sparked rumors and suspicion in the village, prompting her to notice specific details. One option is to use recipe books. Why had Mrs. Gosworth been grumbling about recipes? Was it her regular temperament, or was she upset by something specific? Second, Geoffrey's anxiousness. The young gardener appeared distressed, but his reluctance indicated more than grief. Was he hiding something? 3. The declarations. Food had been the cause of death. But why? They were not Mrs. Gosworth's typical fare. Someone had intentionally chosen them. 4th, Mrs. Hartnell's comment. The Whitakers were unusual but not criminal. Despite her best intentions, the prospect of financial difficulties lingered. Miss Marple smiled to herself, expressing amusement and resolution. People frequently underestimate the complexities of village life. Despite the peaceful appearance, there were numerous rivalries, resentments, and secrets. The solution was to unwind them one thread at a time. For now she would wait. Miss Marple's unwavering intuition and patience allowed her to uncover hidden truths. Miss Marple began unraveling the mystery of Mrs. Gosforth's death, although remaining mute. The next morning, the village was still abuzz with theories and gossip. Mr. Arthur Creddick, the constable in charge of the case, conducted an inadequate investigation. Creddick, a stocky man with a sense of self-importance, prided himself on his efficiency, but in this case, it appeared to mean jumping to conclusions. It's obvious, isn't it? Creddick informed his assistant, young Constable Jennings. Mrs. Gosforth wasn't well liked. Many people might have had a reason to kill her. Do we have any concrete suspects, sir? Jennings asked, his pencil poised over a notepad. Creddick suggested starting with Geoffrey, the gardener. He's young, poor and nervous. Miss Marple, who had been by the station to offer a basket of scone to the constables, noticed the exchange and raised an eyebrow. She simply placed the basket on the desk with a gentle, "Good morning, gentlemen," before leaving. Miss Marple returned to the village and paid special attention to those who had known Mrs. Gosforth the best. Her manner remained unassuming, and her questions were framed as innocent curiosity. Her first stop was the Whitaker home, where she found Dorothy Whitaker in the morning room sipping tea with an air of melancholy. "Such a tragedy!" Dorothy exclaimed, drying her eyes with a handkerchief. "Poor Emily was more like a family member than a co-worker. I can't understand why someone would want to harm her." "Indeed," Miss Marple answered, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "I understand she had a temper, but that's not uncommon in a cook with her experience." Dorothy hesitated. "Yes, she could be a bit sharp-tongued. She has her disagreements with individuals, of course, most recently with my husband Henry," Miss Marple asked, her tone light. Dorothy sighed. Emily had criticized his spending habits. She believed he was too excessive, buying imported wines, holding lavish meals. I think Mom thought she was protecting us in her own way, but Henry didn't take kindly to it. How curious, Miss Marple remarked. And yet she continued to cook for these parties. Dorothy responded, yes, she was always professional, though I do remember her grumbling about not being taken for granted. Miss Marple's next destination was at the local market, where Geoffrey the gardener was unloading crates of vegetables. She approached him with a pleasant grin. Good morning, Jeff. How are you holding up? Geoffrey looked up, shocked. Miss Marple, I'm all right. I guess it's just such a shock, you know. Mrs. Gosforth was great. She was always present. It's difficult to think she's gone. Miss Marple spoke highly of you, she continued softly. I heard you were a hard worker. Jeff flushed. She did. That's characteristic of her. Although strict, she was also fair. Miss Marple maintained a casual tone, implying that working under her may not always be simple. Did you ever have a disagreement? Geoffrey hesitated before shaking his head. Nothing major, miss. She caught me borrowing a bottle of cherry last Christmas. She gave me a fair telling off, but that was it. Miss Marple nodded attentively. I see. Did you notice anything weird in the kitchen yesterday? Geoffrey grimaced and scratched his head. Now that you mention it, there was a weird aroma resembling almonds. I assumed she was employing a special ingredient, but his speech faded off and he became pale. Miss Marple continued, almonds, you say? How fascinating. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Beach, the proprietor of the small bookstore. Mrs. Beach was well known for her acute memory and ability to detect details that others missed. Mrs. Beach said, Oh, Miss Marple, as her visitor entered, I was simply thinking about you. Have you heard about the terrible situation with dear Mrs. Gosforth? Miss Marple, browsing the shelves, agreed that this was a tragedy. I believe she had lately purchased a new cookbook. Do you know where it came from? Mrs. Beach thought, now that you mention it, she bought a book from me last month. Exquisite European Pastries, it was called. She explained that Mrs. Whittaker had wanted something special for the garden party. European pastries, you say? Miss Marple echoed. How interesting. Did she appear happy with the book? Mrs. Beach confessed, not entirely. A week later, she returned the book because the recipes were overly difficult and confusing. She was extremely upset about it. Miss Marple mumbled and filed the information away. Miss Marple paid Dr. Haddock a visit later that day, claiming to have brought him some knitted blankets for his patients. You are a gem, Miss Marple. Haddock smiled and accepted the beautifully folded gift. And how are you dealing with all the excitement? Miss Marple said, Well, enough, Doctor. I was just curious if the coroner's report had shown anything strange. Haddock's expression became grim. Yes, it has. Mrs. Gosforth's death was due to cyanide poisoning. Miss Marple quietly repeated that she had likely consumed a high amount of cyanide. I'm assuming it smells like almonds. Indeed, Haddock verified. Given the date, it's likely that the poison was in something she ate just before she died. Examples include an eclair. Haddock nodded. The eclairs were sent for testing. If I were a betting man, I'd think that's where we'll discover the cyanide. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting in her lap and a cup of tea beside her. The puzzle was starting to take shape. 1. The aroma of almonds. Geoffrey's observation confirmed the presence of cyanide, focusing on the eclairs. 2. The recipe book. Mrs. Gosworth's displeasure with the European pastry book indicated a deeper issue. 3. Financial tensions. Dorothy Whittaker's remark regarding her husband's expenditures highlighted possible causes within the Whittaker household. 4. I borrowed sherry. Although intriguing, Geoffrey's admission did not seem to solve the mystery. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch as a thought occurred to her. What about the book? Could it have been tampered with? If so, by whom? She decided to observe for the time being. The reality, she knew, was frequently buried in plain sight. Patience is all that is required to see this. The investigation deepens, and Miss Marple's delicate inferences lead her ever closer to the truth. The following day, a heavy mist hung over St. Mary's, creating an ethereal atmosphere in the small community. As the constable began their investigation, the villagers gladly volunteered their theories, each more bizarre than the next. Mrs. Gosforth's death became the focal point of everyone's lives, disrupting their usual routines. Constable Credock's initial aim was Geoffrey the gardener. By mid-ma'am, he had summoned Geoffrey to the police for questioning. The young man sat anxiously in the chair opposite Credit, twirling his cap in his hands. "You were observed in the kitchen the day Mrs. Gosworth died." Credit began with a severe voice. "What were you doing there?" "I was just delivering the herbs she requested," and Geoffrey responded swiftly. "Parsley and thyme." She stated that she needed them for the declarations. "Herbs for eclairs," Crack frowned. "Doesn't this sound strange?" Geoffrey shrugged helplessly. I agreed, but Mrs. Gosforth was set in her ways. I did not ask inquiries. "And did you see anything weird while you were there?" Craddock pressed. "Well, I told Miss Marple about the almond smell," Geoffrey remarked, his voice wavering. Craddock leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Something I didn't see at first. You had access to the kitchen. You knew where the sherry was stored, but you were nervous around Mrs. Gosworth. This sounds like a motive to me." Geoffrey's face became pallid. "I swear I did not do anything. I liked Mrs. Gosforth. She was strict yet fair. Why would I damage her?" Craddock was not convinced. "You have means, opportunity, and a questionable alibi. That makes you my primary suspect, son." While Craddock was concentrated on Geoffrey, Miss Marple decided to look into another possibility. Mrs. Edith Plummer, a former governess and close friend of Mrs. Gosforth, was contacted. Mrs. Plummer lived in a charming home on the outskirts of the hamlet, surrounded by a lush garden of flowers and herbs. She greeted Miss Marple with a pot of strong tea and cookies. Mrs. Plummer expressed her dissatisfaction with the firm. "I can't imagine who would want to harm poor Emily," Miss Marple gently replied. She was a strong-willed woman, while stirring her tea. Perhaps she made enemies without realizing it. Mrs. Plummer sighed. Although she had a strong personality, she was extremely loyal. "I believe this is related to the new pastry book she was using." She claimed it was all wrong. Inconsistent measurements and unclear directions. It was quite frustrating for her. Miss Marple's eyes were bright with interest. "Did she ever mention who gave her the book?" "Yes, it was Mrs. Whittaker's idea," Mrs. Plummer remarked with distaste. "She insisted on a European theme for the garden party. Siley wasn't keen on it, but she felt she had no choice." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple muttered. "I wonder if anyone else knew of her frustrations." "Well, she did complain to Mr. Whittaker. Mrs. Plammy-Umber claimed he advised her to stop being so theatrical. That did not set well with Emily, I can tell you." Miss Marple returned to the Whittaker estate that afternoon and met Henry Whittaker in his study. The man shuffled papers on his desk, appearing distracted and annoyed. "Oh, Miss Marple," he murmured, scarcely looking up. "What brought you here?" Miss Marple smiled and continued. "I was hoping to ask a few questions about Mrs. Gosworth." Henry sighed deeply. "I had already told the constable everything I know. Emily was a good cook but had a temper. If you're seeking for enemies, I'd recommend starting with her." "You call them enemies, right?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she have many?" "Plenty," Henry responded plainly. She had no patience for fools and wasn't afraid to say so. Recently, she had a heated disagreement with the butcher over the quality of his lamb chops. "Did her rage ever affect the household staff?" Miss Marple asked. Henry paused. "She had some minor arguments with Geoffrey. Nothing serious." "And how about you, Mr. Whittaker?" "I heard you and Mrs. Gosworth had a heated disagreement about home expenses recently." Henry's face clouded. "That is none of your business, Miss Marple. Emily and I may have had disagreements, but I would never hurt her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course not. Thank you for your time." As the sun fell, Miss Marple visited the constabulary to meet with Constable Jennings, who had just returned from checking Mrs. Gosforth's items. "Good evening, Miss Marple." Jennings approached her and tipped his hat. "What brings you here?" "I was wondering if anything unusual turned up in Mrs. Gosforth's effects," she told me. "Well, there was one thing," Jennings admitted. He pulled a little leather-bound notebook from his pocket. "Her cooking book. Her regular notes and comments are present, but there is an unusual aspect. There's one page missing." Miss Marple frowned and repeated, "A page is missing." "Yes," Jennings responded. "It appears to have been torn out recently. The indentation on the other page may indicate an eclair recipe." "How peculiar," Miss Marple muttered. "May I see it?" Jennings handed her the notebook, which she carefully examined. The shredded sheet appeared jagged, as if it had been pulled quickly. She spotted faint smudges of ink in the margins, indicating an attempt to erase a message. "Thank you, Constable," she replied, returning the notebook. "This has been quite informative." Miss Marple sat in her lovely parlour that evening and reviewed the day's results. Geoffrey has one alibi. The gardener was the most obvious suspect, but his uneasiness was likely due to fear rather than guilt. Second, Whittaker's involvement. Both Dorothy and Henry had motives, but neither looked inclined to act on them. 3. The missing page. The torn recipe implied an intentional action. Was it feasible that the poison was added during the preparation of the eclairs? 4. The pastry cookbook. Mrs. Gosforth's dissatisfaction with the novel suggested deeper tensions. Could this have been part of the plot? Miss Marple's fingers paused in their knitting as she contemplated the riddle before her. The lost page and modified recipe provided crucial clues. To learn the truth, she needed to delve further into the secrets of St. Mary Me. She lay aside her knitting and got ready for bed, smiling faintly. Tomorrow will bring new surprises, and Miss Marple was prepared. The inquiry progresses. With several suspects and tempting clues pointing in various directions, the mystery of the lost recipe page adds another layer of interest, bringing Miss Marple closer to the matter. The mood in St. Mary's got more strained with each passing day. Miss Marple discreetly resumed her inquiry, acquiring insights that others viewed as useless, while Constable Cred remained focused on Geoffrey. She understood that even seemingly trivial things might disclose the truth. The annual church bazaar in the village went on as planned. But the presence of Mrs. Gosforth's murder overshadowed the festive atmosphere. Miss Marple arrived early and put up her knitting station efficiently. The locals talked around the stalls, offering jams, vintage books, and hand-stitched linen. Conversations centered on the strange death. Mrs. Hartnell boldly told a small crowd near the baked goods booth that she must have eaten the eclairs. "I've always said that gourmet pastries are nothing but hassle." Colonel Bantry responded, "Oh, nonsense," while scrutinizing a rack of gardening supplies. "This is not an accident. It is murder, mark my words. Someone wanted Mrs. Gosforth gone." Miss Marple's ears perked up during the exchange, but she did not respond. Instead, she focused on organizing her yarn skins and waited for a chance to learn more. Miss Marple's patience was rewarded when Mrs. Whittaker arrived at the bazaar with her housekeeper, Agnes. The two women browsed the stalls, conversing in quiet whispers. Agnes commented, "Dorothy, you've been on edge all week," as they paused to inspect some china teacups. "Can you blame me?" Dorothy responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Emily's death, Henry has been exhibiting unusual behavior. He has been locking himself in the study for hours on end." "I'm not sure what he's hiding," Agnes said sympathetically. "Men can be very secretive, but I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." Miss Marple, pretending to examine lace doilies nearby, took note of Dorothy's statement. Miss Marple arrived at the Whittaker estate as the bazaar was coming to an end. Agnes met her at the entrance, expressing surprise but not displeasure. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Agnes stated. "What brings you here?" Miss Marple smiled warmly as she replied, "I was hoping to have a word with Mrs. Whittaker." Agnes hesitated. "I'm afraid she is resting. It has been a difficult week, but please let me know if there is anything I can do for you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Actually, there is. Mrs. Gosforth used a new recipe book before her death. Do you know where it might be?" Agnes frowned. "I believe it's still in the kitchen. Mrs. Gosforth was very cautious about her belongings, so he didn't touch anything else. Do you understand?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "Might I have a look?" Agnes hesitantly took her to the kitchen. The kitchen seemed unnaturally quiet. Its shining surfaces attest to Mrs. Gosforth's meticulousness. The recipe book was on the counter, its cover somewhat weathered. Miss Marple carefully opened and flipped through the pages until she found the section on pastries. She halted at the recipe for eclairs. Although the instructions were explicit, she saw something unusual. A small indentation on the paper indicated a handwritten note that had been erased. "Curious," Miss Marple remarked. She lightly brushed her fingers across the page, noticing its uneven roughness. "What is it?" Agnes asked, looking over her shoulder. "Just a little mystery," Miss Marple answered. "Tell me, Agnes, did anyone else handle this book recently?" Agnes thought for a moment. "Mrs. Whittaker handed it to Mrs. Gosforth, but I don't believe anyone else used it. At least not that I am aware of." Miss Marple nodded attentively. "Thanks, Agnes. You've been quite helpful." On her way home, Miss Marple went by Dr. Haddock's office to explain her findings. "Do you see faint indentations on the recipe page?" Hawk repeated, inspecting the book. "Yes," Miss Marple affirmed. "I suppose a note was written there and then removed. It could be a crucial clue." Haddock took a small magnifying glass and examined the page. "There is clearly something here. I can apply graphite powder to make the writing more visible." "Would you?" Miss Marple inquired, her eyes gleaming in anticipation. After a few moments of cautious labor, Haddock produced a faint but visible note. "Use sparingly. Too much will ruin the flavor." Miss Marple's expression became contemplative. "How intriguing. This shows that the recipe was purposely adjusted. But who and why?" That evening, Miss Marple decided to take a walk through the hamlet, her mind racing with ideas. As she passed the Whittaker estate, she noticed a light in the study. She paused, her gaze narrowing as she noticed someone moving inside. Henry Whittaker was pacing back and forth, his face filled with dread. Miss Marple paused briefly before going on her journey. The missing recipe sheet, erased note, and Henry's unusual conduct were all part of a mystery that was gradually fitting together. Back in her snug parlor, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in hand. She reviewed the day's discoveries. One is the altered recipe. The obliterated note indicated deliberate interference. The recipe's directions were initially added, but later removed. Second, consider Henry Whittaker's behavior. His late-night pacing indicated guilt or anxiousness. Was he hiding something linked to Mrs. Gosforth's death? Dorothy's suspicions about Henry strengthened the belief that the Whittakers were more involved than they admitted. Fourth, the aroma of almonds. The cyanide's peculiar aroma was the most convincing evidence linking the poison to the eclairs. Miss Marple's fingers paused as she had a startling notion. If the recipe was altered, it may not have been intended for Mrs. Gosforth. Could the intended target have been someone else? Her mind was racing with possibilities, but she knew not to jump to conclusions. She reminded herself that the truth is often veiled beneath human complexity. She only needed patience and one more hint. Miss Marple's calm inquiry uncovers a hidden clue that could alter the direction of the case. The revised formula in the deleted note adds layers of intrigue, bringing her closer to the truth. St. Mary, formerly portrayed as a serene figure, had become a source of mystery. Miss Marple strolled unobtrusively about the village, relying on snatches of conversations, observations, and her deep understanding of human nature. Mrs. Gosforth's death was a result of a complex network of relationships and secrets inside the community. Not just the eclairs, Miss Marple decided to visit Mr. Rudge, the village butcher known for his harsh manner and sharp tongue. Mrs. Gosforth had complained about Mr. Rudge's lamb chops the previous day. As Miss Marple entered the shop, Mr. Rudge was slicing a roast with studied precision. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "What can I do for you?" "A bit of lamb, perhaps." "Good morning, Mr. Rudge," Miss Marple said, smiling. "I was hoping to question you about Mrs. Gosforth." Mr. Rudge scowled. The wife was never satisfied. Although there were always flaws, I wouldn't wish her experience on anyone. Miss Marple agreed. "I understand she was quite unhappy with you last month." Mr. Rudge snorted. "She stated that my lamb chops were overly greasy. They told me I was operating a subpar organization." He paused to wipe his hands on his apron. But Emily was not one to harbor grudges. We concluded our discussion. Miss Marple tilted her head carefully. "Do you remember her purchasing anything strange from you recently? Perhaps something she could have used to bake?" Mr. Rudge frowned, considering. "Now that you mention it, she did request a little serving of bitter almonds a few weeks ago. They stated it was for a specific recipe." Miss Marple repeated bitter almonds with a neutral tone. "Yes, but I did not have any." He advised her to seek help from the pharmacy. "Thank you, Mr. Rudge," Miss Marple replied kindly. "You've been quite helpful." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected invitation to dine with the Whiters. Dorothy and Henry organized a modest meeting to restore a sense of normalcy. The guests, Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and Mrs. Plummer, each had their own theories regarding the case. Miss Marple, a keen observer, noticed the strained relationship between Henry and Dorothy. During a simple dinner, the talk quickly focused on Mrs. Gosforth. Dorothy's voice trembled as she expressed her shock at the news. To believe that someone from our village could be capable of such a thing. Colonel Bantry argued that it may not have been a villager. It's possible she was a nomad or harbored a grudge from the past. Henry cleared his throat, his voice brusque. Let's avoid reckless speculation. The police will handle it soon enough. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Henry's glance at her revealed uneasiness, highlighting the importance of paying attention to details. After supper, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, conversing softly with Agnes. The housekeeper seems eager to unburden herself. Mrs. Whittaker's been so nervous lately, Agnes acknowledged, and Mr. Whittaker has been snapping at everyone. It's as if they are both hiding something. What makes you believe that? Miss Marple asked gently. Agnes hesitated. I overheard them bickering in the study the night before Mrs. Gosforth's death. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned a debt, but Mr. Whittaker instructed her to be silent. Miss Marple repeated, a debt. Her interest increased. Agnes replied, yes, but I don't know the details. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but they were shouting. Miss Marple touched her hand reassuringly. You've been quite helpful, my dear. Sometimes the simplest details can make all the difference. The following day, Miss Marple rode the bus to Much Benham to visit the pharmacist. The shop was small, dimly lighted, and filled with the aroma of herbs and medicinal ingredients. Mr. Price, the apothecary, looked at her with curiosity. Miss Marple, what brought you here? I was hoping you might remember a recent customer, she explained. Mrs. Gosforth from St. Mary. We may have purchased bitter almonds from you. Mr. Price scowled. Ah, yes. About a fortnight ago she requested a tiny sum. The request seemed unusual, but she explained it was for baking. Did anyone else ask about bitter almonds about the same time? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Price scratched his chin. Mrs. Whittaker was actually here the day before. Although she did not purchase almonds, she expressed a keen interest in Mrs. Gosworth's order. Miss Marple maintained a calm demeanor, but her mind raced. Thank you, Mr. Price. You've been quite helpful. When she returned to St. Mary's, Miss Marple decided it was time to confront Dorothy Whittaker. She discovered her in the garden, trimming roses with a dazed look. Mrs. Whittaker and Miss Marple began, May I have a word? Dorothy looked up, shocked. Of course, Miss Marple, what is it? Miss Marple expressed her interest in learning more about Mrs. Gosforth's demise, using a conversational tone. Consider the recipe book with an erased note and a missing page. Dorothy tightened her grip on the pruning shears. What are you implying? Miss Marple smiled faintly and responded, Nothing, my dear. But I can't stop thinking if someone tampered with the eclairs. After all, bitter almonds can be extremely hazardous if not utilized carefully. Dorothy's cheeks paled. I don't understand what you mean. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Mrs. Whittaker, if you have any concerns, please come forward. No matter how deeply hidden, secrets eventually surface. Dorothy was about to respond when Henry called out from the house, Dorothy, where are you? Dorothy rushed inside, leaving Miss Marple with unanswered questions. Miss Marple reviewed her results that evening. One type of almond is bitter. Mrs. Gosworth and Mrs. Whittaker were interested in the chemical, which is a crucial component of cyanide. 2 is Whittaker's debt. Agnes's confession revealed financial difficulties, which could be a motive. 3 instances of missing pages and deleted notes. These indicated deliberate manipulation with the recipe. 4th, Dorothy's reply. Her anxiety suggested guilt, but was it her own or someone else's? Miss Marple paused her knitting when she realized something. Dorothy's actions were not isolated. This was not the only hand involved. Someone was behind the scenes directing events. Miss Marple was determined to find the truth before another tragedy, as the web of secrets in St. Mary's began to unravel. The tension rises as Miss Marple finds more secrets and faces potential suspects. The connections between bitter almonds, the Whittaker's debt, and the altered recipe help pinpoint the culprit, but the case remains unsolved. 40 a theft occurred at the Whittaker residence, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of St. Mary's. The latest crime, coming so soon after Mrs. Gosforth's murder, changed the Ville's already unsettling focus. Miss Marple became increasingly convinced that the events were connected and resolved to investigate further. The news spread rapidly. Dorothy Whittaker's ancient sapphire jewelry, a family relic, was stolen from her bedroom. Dorothy revealed to Constable Cretic, who arrived to investigate, that it was locked away in her jewelry box. I can't comprehend how anyone could have handled it. The constable scratched his head. There are no traces of forced entry. Could it have been someone in the house? Dorothy hesitated. I don't want to accuse anyone, but Agnes has access to the bedroom. Agnes, your housekeeper? Katic asked with a raised eyebrow. Dorothy swiftly responded, She's been with us for years. I can't believe she would do such a thing, but there's no one else I can think of. Miss Marple, who came to return a book Dorothy had borrowed her, silently witnessed the transaction. Dorothy's distress appeared genuine, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands trembled as she talked, indicating fear rather than upset. Miss Marple waited after the constable had left. My dear, this is all very unfortunate, she remarked gently. That brooch must mean a great deal to you. Dorothy sniffed and nodded. Say it was my grandmother's. Henry will be infuriated. The item has been passed down through generations. Of course, Miss Marple said. May I ask, was it taken the same night as Mrs. Gosforth's death? Dorothy's eyes widened. Why, yeah. How did you know? Miss Marple grinned slightly. A easy deduction, my dear. Timing isn't always a coincidence. Dorothy fidgeted with her handkerchief. Do you believe the theft and murder are related? It's conceivable, Miss Marple said. Crimes often connect in unexpected ways. Did you notice anything weird around the house that day? Dorothy hesitated before shaking her head. No, just the usual staff and a few neighbors who stopped by. Miss Marple nodded attentively. I am confident that the brooch will be found soon. These things frequently happen. Later that day, Miss Marple paid Agnes a call at the Whittaker estate. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, kneading dough with determination. Agnes addressed Miss Marple, glancing up. Have you come to see the latest excitement? Miss Marple responded sympathetically when asked about the brooch. You must be very upset, Agnes shrugged. I have nothing to conceal. Allow them to search my belongings if they wish. It will make no difference. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table, her keen eyes analyzing the surroundings. Do you have any idea who might have taken it? Agnes hesitated. Mrs. Whittaker has been under a lot of stress recently. Mr. Whittaker, who may be difficult to live with, stole a brooch. That's not what I expected from either of them. Miss Marple leaned forward, along with other staff or a guest. Agnes shakes her head. We are a little household. Someone must have had a cause for taking the brooch. Miss Marple grinned. This is quite true, sweetie. Motive is often the key to solving a mystery. Colonel Bantry, always ready to express his opinions, approached Miss Marple later that day. Have you heard about the brooch? He inquired, taking a seat in the parlor. I have, Miss Marple answered, pouring him a cup of tea. Bantry declared, I will tell you what I think. It is a distraction, plain and simple. The theft was intended to divert attention away from the murder case. Miss Marple expressed interest in the hypothesis with a thoughtful face. Do you have any suspects in mind? Bantry rubs his chin. Could be Geoffrey. The lad is having financial difficulties. Or perhaps Henry Whittaker himself. He's been acting peculiar, hasn't he? Miss Marple mumbled. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. What about Dorothy? People behave strangely when they are stressed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yes, they do, but we should not jump to conclusions. The reality is sometimes more complex than it seems. The next morning, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her mind engaged with the case. She noticed a bunch of children playing near the churchyard's hedgerow. One of the children, Miss Marple, called and held up a small object. Look at what I found. The stolen brooch's sapphire gleamed in sunshine. Miss Marple asked, How extraordinary, as she carefully examined it. Where did you find it? The toddler responded by pointing to the wall. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The brooch's placement suggests it was dumped hastily. But by whom and why? Later that day, Miss Marple sought Reverend Leonard Clement's opinion on the situation. Miss Marple, replied the vicar, I suspect you've made some headway in this mystery. Miss Marple replied modestly, However, I am beginning to suspect that the theft of the brooch is part of a much wider conspiracy. The vicar lifted an eyebrow. What about a larger scheme? Miss Marple nodded. The brooch was discarded, possibly to divert attention. But the true issue is from what? Do you believe the thief and murderer are the same person? Clement asked. Miss Marple's expression became thoughtful. It's possible, but I believe the theft was staged to conceal an important information regarding the murder. Miss Marple sat by the fireside that evening, crocheting and reflecting on the previous days. 1. The timing of the theft. The brooch was removed on the same night as Mrs. Gosforth's death, indicating a purposeful connection. 2. The discarded brooch. The location near the churchyard suggested panic or intent to mislead. 3. Agnes's confidence. The housekeeper's demeanor indicated she had nothing to hide, but her loyalty to the Whitakers complicated matters. 4. Dorothy's dread and anxiousness showed that she knew more than she let on. Miss Marple halted in her stitching when she had a startling notion. The brooch was not the key. It was a diversion. The thief's intended concealment provided the genuine clue. "I believe we're getting closer," she said to herself. "Now it's just a matter of putting the final pieces together." This segment heightens the mystery by presenting a new crime that diverts the villagers' attention. Miss Marple's investigation into the theft and murder leads to the resolution of the mystery. The finding of the brooch shed a strange light on the already complicated case. Miss Marple maintained her calm manner while analyzing the latest twist. She was well versed in human behavior and had a keen eye for details that others would overlook. She decided to undertake a delicate test to uncover the truth. Miss Marple's first step was to organize an innocuous gathering. She hosted crucial figures in the case for tea at her lovely cottage. The characters include Dorothy and Henry Whittaker, Geoffrey Harrove, Colonel Bantry, and Agnes, who surprised everyone. The invitation was intended to promote positivity and harmony in the turbulent town. Each attendee arrived with varied degrees of distrust and anxiety, their expressions expressing inner fears. Miss Marple's calm attitude appeared to put them at ease. During tea time, the talk centered on light themes such as the weather, a new vicar in the nearby parish, and Mrs. Bantry's prize-winning Dallas. Miss Marple's queries were soft but probing, carefully planned to elicit nuanced responses. Miss Marple greeted Mrs. Whittaker with a grin. "You have a keen eye for detail. Did you observe anything peculiar at the garden party before Mrs. Gosforth became ill?" Dorothy hesitated, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. "No, not really. Everything seemed totally normal. And you, Mr. Whittaker," Miss Marple added. Henry frowned. "I wasn't really paying attention. I was caught up in a chat with the Colonel." Miss Marple looked at Geoffrey and asked, "And you, Mr. Harrove? You were the center of attention at one point, I believe." Geoffrey blushed due to his ridiculous fight with Mrs. Gosforth. She had a knack of provoking others. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Although she may be blunt, her words could mask underlying issues. Her words hung in the air, their meaning ambiguous and unsettling. Miss Marple took a quick break near the end of the gathering before returning with a familiar item. Mrs. Gosworth's recipe book, found in Whittaker's kitchen. She placed the book on the table and commented on its fascinating array of recipes. And yet it appears this book holds more secrets than culinary delights. The room became quiet. Dorothy's face became pale and Henry stiffened visibly. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" Colonel Bantry inquired. Miss Marple opened the book to the page where the erased note was located. "This chocolate recipe is quite interesting. Somebody went to considerable lengths to change it. Why, I wonder?" No one replied. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, her sharp eyes catching every reaction. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her voice quiet, yet forceful. "I've been fascinated about bitter almonds." Dorothy's hand trembled as she reached for her husband's prescription at the apothecary, despite the ingredient's unexpected appearance in our village. "Henry, maybe we should," Henry cut her off abruptly. "Enough of this nonsense, Miss Marple. You're meddling with situations you don't understand." Miss Marple maintained an unwavering face. "Oh, Mr. Whittaker, I do understand. I understand that Mrs. Gosforth's death was not accidental. It was meticulously planned, and it involved more than one individual." Dorothy gasped, but it was Agnes who spoke next, her voice shaking with wrath. "Are you saying I had something to do with this?" "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple responded kindly. "But you may have seen or heard something without realizing its significance. Agnes, do you recall the disagreement between Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker the night before the garden party?" Agnes hesitated and then nodded. "Yes, but I wasn't sure what it was about. Something to do with money." Henry stood hastily, scraping his chair against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Dorothy and I had nothing to do with Mrs. Gosworth's passing." Despite Miss Marple's calm demeanor, the brooch was quickly stolen and discarded. Why would a thief abandon something valuable? Perhaps the heist was a ruse to divert attention. Dorothy burst into tears, losing her calm. "I can't keep this up, Henry, I cannot." Henry reacted fiercely. "Dorothy, get yourself together." Miss Marple's voice sliced through the tension like a dagger. "Mrs. Whittaker, I suppose you tweaked the recipe, correct? But you did not act alone. Your husband's obligations had grown too great to manage, and Mrs. Gosforth's death provided a solution. You tampered with the eclairs, confident she wouldn't notice the bitterness." Dorothy's sobs became louder. "I did not want to. This was Henry's idea. He claimed we'd lose everything if we didn't act enough," Henry exclaimed. "You have no idea what you are talking about, Miss Marple." Miss Marple softened her look as she said, "You have no proof." "Mr. Whittaker, proof is often found in the smallest things. Your wife's dread, defensiveness, and behaviors contributed to Mrs. Gosworth's death. They all point to the truth. You misjudged how much people observe, even if they appear unassuming." At that point, the door opened to reveal Constable Creddick, who had been listening from the hall. "I believe that's enough, Mr. Whittaker," the politician replied. "You and your wife will need to come with me for questioning." Dorothy collapsed in her chair, her expression filled with misery. Henry remained obstinate and looked at Miss Marple. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" remarked the old woman. Miss Marple looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and resolution. "This is not cunning, Mr. Whittaker. It's only a matter of knowing human nature. After the Whiters were gone, Miss Marple sat peacefully in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly. Colonel Bantry, who remained behind, shook his head in bewilderment. "Miss Marple has done it again. I'd never have guessed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is not about guessing, Colonel. It is all about observation. People frequently reveal more than they intended." Bantry chuckled. "You make it sound simple." Miss Marble's look became contemplative. "Colonel, while human nature is not always simple, it is consistent, which is the key. This portion culminates in a showdown where Miss Marple uncovers the true offenders. Her psychological skills and subtle manipulation reveal a complex web of deception, ultimately leading to a successful resolution. The arrest of Whittaker sent shockwaves across St. Mary's. The community, once famed for its calm charm and harmless talk, is suddenly buzzing with scandal." Miss Marple, on the other hand, considered the case far from closed. As she sipped her evening tea, she reminisced on the events that led up to this point, with one final question in mind. Was Henry Whittaker really the mastermind? Was there more layer to this complicated mystery? The following morning, Miss Marple paid Reverend Clement a visit at the vicarage. Over tea and scones, she expressed her doubts. "Henry Whittaker is undoubtedly guilty of tampering with the eclairs," she added, stirring her drink. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story," said the vicar, raising an eyebrow. "You mean someone else might be involved?" "Exactly," Miss Marple responded. "Consider the theft of a brooch. It feels out of place, as if it was meant to accuse the Whiters." Reverend Clement nodded attentively. "And you think someone might have manipulated them?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not uncommon, dear Leonard, for a clever person to exploit another's desperation." Miss Marple visited the apothecary in much bonhomie, where Mr. Rudge welcomed her with his usual brusque demeanor. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his chippy spectacles. "Come to inquire about the bitter almonds again, have you?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as ever. "I was wondering if you've had any other unusual requests for them recently." R.J. frowned. "Not that I recall, with the exception of Mrs. Gosforth's order." "Oh, sure," Miss Marple murmured. "Wasn't there another buy soon after hers?" The apothecary hesitated before rummaging through his ledger. "Yes, there was. A tiny order, placed by I am curious about this. Jeff Harrove." Miss Marple's gaze intensified imperceptibly. "Curious indeed. Thank you, Mr. Raj. You've been quite helpful." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Geoffrey, who was busy tending to his roses. He looked up as she approached, a nervous smile flickering across his face. "Miss Marple," he murmured, wiping dirt off his hands, "what brings you here?" "I was hoping for a word," Miss Marple said. "About Mrs. Gosforth." Geoffrey stiffened. "I've already informed the police about everything I know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. But I couldn't help noticing something odd. You purchased bitter almonds shortly after Mrs. Gosforth's death. Can I ask why? Geoffrey's face had lost its color. I was baking for the church fete. Miss Marple tilted her head. Baking, you say? How curious, given that you frequently told Mrs. Bantry that you can't tell a whisk from a rolling pin. Geoffrey stammered. It wasn't for me. It was for a friend. Could this friend be Henry Whittaker? Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as ever. Geoffrey's shoulders slumped. All right, he muttered. Yes, it was for Henry. He said he needed it for something important, and I didn't ask questions. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And the brooch. Did Henry ask you to take that as well? Geoffrey's head shot up, panic in his eyes. No, I didn't steal anything. Miss Marple's voice softened. Sometimes, Geoffrey, we become accomplices without even realizing it. Perhaps Henry used you more than you know. Returning home, Miss Marple sorted through the notes she'd made throughout the investigation. A seemingly minor detail now leapt out at her. The handwriting in Mrs. Gosforth's recipe book didn't match Dorothy Whittaker's. She fetched the recipe book and compared it with a letter Dorothy had written her weeks ago. The difference was clear. The writing in the recipe book was bolder, more angular, distinctly masculine. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Could it be that Henry Whittaker hadn't altered the recipe himself, but had coerced someone else into doing so? Determined to uncover the final truth, Miss Marple requested a meeting at the vicarage, inviting Constable Creedick, Colonel Bantry, Geoffrey, Dorothy, and even Agnes. The vicar, ever supportive, presided over the gathering with a quiet sense of gravitas. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but firm. The events of the past few days have left us all troubled, but I believe the time has come to set things right. She turned to Geoffrey. Mr. Hargrove, you've been drawn into this web through no fault of your own, but you've withheld information, and that has only made matters worse. Geoffrey squirmed in his seat. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple held up a hand. I understand, but we must be honest if we are to reach the truth. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Agnes. You've been remarkably steadfast throughout this ordeal. Agnes. But I couldn't help wondering, why didn't you speak up about the argument between Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker sooner? Agnes hesitated, then said quietly, I didn't think it mattered. But it does matter, Miss Marple replied, because that argument wasn't about money, as we all assumed. It was about a plan to remove Mrs. Gosforth as an obstacle. The room fell silent. Henry Whittaker may have devised the scheme, Miss Marple continued, but he couldn't have carried it out alone. Someone had to alter the recipe. Someone had to steal the brooch to create a diversion, and someone had to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. Her eyes rested on Geoffrey. And that someone was you. Geoffrey leapt to his feet. That's absurd. I didn't kill anyone. No, Miss Marple agreed. But you aided Henry in his efforts, whether knowingly or not. The bitter almonds, the recipe alterations, they were all part of his design. Geoffrey's face crumpled. He said it would fix everything. That no one would get hurt. Miss Marple's voice softened. But someone did get hurt, Geoffrey, and now it's time to make amends. By the end of the meeting, Geoffrey had confessed his involvement, providing crucial details that solidified Henry Whittaker's guilt. Dorothy, too, admitted her role, her tearful apologies revealing a woman torn between loyalty and fear. Constable Creedick, impressed by Miss Marple's deductions, promised swift action. You've done it again, Miss Marple, he said with admiration. Miss Marple demurred. It's not about cleverness, Constable. It's about understanding the complexities of human nature. People often reveal themselves in the smallest of ways. That evening, as the village began to absorb the revelations, Miss Marple returned to her parlor. The fire crackled warmly, and her knitting needles clicked softly as she reflected on the case. Such a shame, she murmured. So much trouble, all for greed and desperation. But perhaps now St. Mary me can find peace again. She set down her knitting and reached for her tea, her thoughts all ready, turning to the next puzzle life might present. This section resolves the mystery by unraveling the full extent of Henry Whittaker's plot and Geoffrey's reluctant involvement. Miss Marple's sharp mind and quiet determination bring clarity and justice, ensuring that the village and its secrets can finally rest. St. Mary me with its postcard perfect. Cottages and winding lanes began to settle back into its usual rhythms, yet the events surrounding Mrs. Gosforth's death lingered like an unwelcome fog. For days after the arrest of Henry Whittaker and Geoffrey Hargrove, the villagers moved about their routines with an air of suppressed excitement and unease, the drama of the case fueling endless speculation and reflection. Miss Marple, as always, stayed quietly in the background. At the grocer's on a crisp morning, Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley could be found in their usual corner, whispering animatedly over a shelf of tinned goods. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her voice tinged with satisfaction, "I always thought Henry Whittaker was up to no good. The way he carried on at the garden party. And poor Dorothy, such a timid little thing. Imagine her being drawn into something so dreadful." Mrs. Bantry nodded but hesitated. "I do wonder, though, what made Geoffrey Hargrove help them. He always seemed so mild-mannered. Perhaps Miss Marple will explain it all someday." "Oh, I wouldn't hold my breath," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "She never tells more than she needs to, but I'll wager she knew everything long before the rest of us." Reverend Clement sat in his study in the vicarage, gazing out the window. "How curious, given that you frequently told Mrs. Bantry that you can't tell a whisk from a rolling pin." Geoffrey stammered. It wasn't for me. It was for a friend." "Could this friend be Henry Whittaker?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as ever. Geoffrey's shoulders slumped. "All right," he muttered. "Yes, it was for Henry. He said he needed it for something important, and I didn't ask questions." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And the brooch. Did Henry ask you to take that as well?" Geoffrey's head shot up, panic in his eyes. "No, I didn't steal anything." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Sometimes, Geoffrey, we become accomplices without even realizing it. Perhaps Henry used you more than you know." Returning home, Miss Marple sorted through the notes she'd made throughout the investigation. A seemingly minor detail now leapt out at her. The handwriting in Mrs. Gosforth's recipe book didn't match Dorothy Whittaker's. She fetched the recipe book and compared it with a letter Dorothy had written her weeks ago. The difference was clear. The writing in the recipe book was bolder, more angular, distinctly masculine. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Could it be that Henry Whittaker hadn't altered the recipe himself, but had coerced someone else into doing so? Determined to uncover the final truth, Miss Marple requested a meeting at the vicarage, inviting Constable Creedick, Colonel Bantry, Geoffrey, Dorothy, and even Agnes. The vicar, ever supportive, presided over the gathering with a quiet sense of gravitas. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but firm. "The events of the past few days have left us all troubled, but I believe the time has come to set things right." She turned to Geoffrey. "Mr. Hargrove, you've been drawn into this web through no fault of your own, but you've withheld information, and that has only made matters worse." Geoffrey squirmed in his seat. "I didn't mean to." Miss Marple held up a hand. "I understand, but we must be honest if we are to reach the truth." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Agnes. "You've been remarkably steadfast throughout this ordeal." "Agnes, but I couldn't help wondering, why didn't you speak up about the argument between Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker sooner?" Agnes hesitated, then said quietly, "I didn't think it mattered." "But it does matter," Miss Marple replied, "because that argument wasn't about money, as we all assumed. It was about a plan to remove Mrs. Gosforth as an obstacle." The room fell silent. "Henry Whittaker may have devised the scheme," Miss Marple continued, "but he couldn't have carried it out alone. Someone had to alter the recipe. Someone had to steal the brooch to create a diversion. And someone had to ensure the blame fell elsewhere." Her eyes rested on Geoffrey. "And that someone was you?" Geoffrey leapt to his feet. "That's absurd." "I didn't kill anyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you aided Henry in his efforts, whether knowingly or not. The bitter almonds, the recipe alterations, they were all part of his design." Geoffrey's face crumpled. "He said it would fix everything, that no one would get hurt." Miss Marple's voice softened. "But someone did get hurt, Geoffrey, and now it's time to make amends." By the end of the meeting, Geoffrey had confessed his involvement, providing crucial details that solidified Henry Whittaker's guilt. Dorothy, too, admitted her role, her tearful apologies revealing a woman torn between loyalty and fear. Constable Creedick, impressed by Miss Marple's deductions, promised swift action. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said with admiration. Miss Marple demurred. "It's not about cleverness, Constable. It's about understanding the complexities of human nature. People often reveal themselves in the smallest of ways." That evening, as the village began to absorb the revelations, Miss Marple returned to her parlour. The fire crackled warmly, and her knitting needles clicked softly as she reflected on the case. "Such a shame," she murmured. "So much trouble, all for greed and desperation. But perhaps now St. Mary me can find peace again." She set down her knitting and reached for her tea, her thoughts all ready, turning to the next puzzle life might present. This section resolves the mystery by unraveling the full extent of Henry Whittaker's plot and Geoffrey's reluctant involvement. Miss Marple's sharp mind and quiet determination bring clarity and justice, ensuring that the village and its secrets can finally rest. St. Mary me with its postcard perfect. Cottages and winding lanes began to settle back into its usual rhythms, yet the events surrounding Mrs. Gosforth's death lingered like an unwelcome fog. For days after the arrest of Henry Whittaker and Geoffrey Hargrove, the villagers moved about their routines with an air of suppressed excitement and unease, the drama of the case fueling endless speculation and reflection. Miss Marple, as always, stayed quietly in the background. At the grocer's on a crisp morning, Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley could be found in their usual corner, whispering animatedly over a shelf of tinned goods. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her voice tinged with satisfaction, "I always thought Henry Whittaker was up to no good. The way he carried on at the garden party. And poor Dorothy, such a timid little thing. Imagine her being drawn into something so dreadful." Mrs. Bantry nodded but hesitated. "I do wonder, though, what made Geoffrey Hargrove help them. He always seemed so mild-mannered. Perhaps Miss Marple will explain it all someday." "Oh, I wouldn't hold my breath," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "She never tells more than she needs to, but I'll wager she knew everything long before the rest of us." Reverend Clement sat in his study in the vicarage, gazing out the window.